think there is no point carrying this conversation on without addressing what makes the composite of language. What are these parts? Because I do not know myself.
Okay. I would say that at least four things had to occur before we get to language as we know it. The first is not obvious. Chimpanzees, our closest living ancestors, are mainly competitive and minimally cooperative. So the first had to be a switch from competing to cooperating.
Right.
And unless you cooperate, you can't have language. Okay. Mm-hmm. Then there had to be at least two stages that are nonverbal before words are produced by an infant. The first of those stages is an emotional bond between the infant and the mother. And this occurs during the first 6 months. And it occurs because of a evolutionary quirk. Human infants are the most helpless primate when they're born. Their brains are only 25% of their adult volume. The chimpanzee's brain is about 50%. And similarly, the skeletal nervous system of an infant is so underdeveloped that they can't even crawl or walk until they're about 6 months old. That means that they have to be cradled. Now, one of the wonders of evolution is how that act of cradling actually facilitated the development of language. Because when an infant is cradled, she's held about 7 inches from the mother's eyes. And that allows the mother and the infant to share gaze and interact.
Pass on information.
And interact emotionally. So that's the first step. It also turns out that infants are exquisitely sensitive to faces, particularly their eyes and their mouth. So because of cradling, which is a byproduct of our becoming bipedal, which I won't go into now,
Yes,
and only humans are bipedal, possibly some of our ancestors, but not chimpanzees. Infants are cradled, and that leads to this emotional bond between the mother and the infant. Then when the infant is about 6 months old, she does begin to crawl and walk and become interested in external objects. See, at first it's just a dyad between the mother and the infant. But that relation changes to a triadic relation between the mother, the infant, and an external object. So the infant can point to an external object, can pick it up, can show it to the mother, and they engage in what's called joint attention, where not only is the infant emotionally bonded to the mother in a dyadic sense, but now they share attention to external objects. That's also uniquely human. That had to evolve separately.
The act of pointing.
The act of pointing and the act of sharing attention to an external object.
Right.
And then, and only then, can the mother say, well, that's a flower, that's a glass, that's a toy, and the infant, in sharing attention to the object, can say, yes, that is a flower, that is a toy, and so on. That's how you get the first word. So all of those steps, from competition to cooperation,
cradling,
through cradling and into subjectivity, to joint attention, were necessary before the first words were produced.
Right.
And so when you ask, how did language evolve? You have to be prepared to say how all of those other steps evolved.
Hmm.
That tremendously simplifies the problem.
So just to try and understand, and I think, I mean, even though I did understand these components from having read a lot of your work and having sat in a lecture with you, but this is the first time they've been presented to me like this. So let me just try and walk through them. The first one that you said is that as soon as competition, the pressure of competition changes to a pressure of cooperation, now there is a need to interact, and therefore language has a possibility of emerging, right? So like this is us thinking in survival pressure kind of a thing. The second thing that we're talking about is the fact that the human baby is helpless, and therefore it needs to be put near another adult, and through proxy, by the proxy of that, there is information being passed on in some sense,
Right.
which is in some sense through eye contact and stuff. And
Right.
then the third step is the first contact, the first interaction that I'm having with my mother is us sharing an emotional state sort of by looking into each other's eyes, or at least, you know, whatever version of that. And the fourth is then when my mother starts pointing to or referring to things or attending to things, and I look at the same thing she is looking at.
And
This is
sharing
very
attention.
right. This is sharing attention. Right. So those are the four simplified steps as to four things that we need to explain before we begin to opine upon the evolution of language.
Right.
Right.